Hi students, it is still Thursday, September 3rd, and I am going to read chapters 13 and 14. It is already 12:39, so let's see if I can finish that before our end of lunch Google Meet. Chapter 13, I'm just starting from the beginning, I think that's easier. Chapter 13, Money Worries. There came a night, however, when Mrs. Popper, having put the children to bed, stopped Mr. Popper on his way to the cellar. "Papa," she said, "I must talk to you. Come and sit down." "Yes, my love," said Mr. Popper. "What is on your mind?" "Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "I'm glad to see you having such a nice vacation. And I must say that it's been easier than usual to keep the place tidy, with you down in the basement all the time. But Papa, what are we to do for money?" "What is the trouble?" asked Mr. Popper. "Well, of course, the penguins have to eat, but have you any idea what the bills for all those live fish are? I'm sure I don't know how we're ever going to pay for them. And the engineer who put in the basement freezing plant keeps ringing the doorbell and asking for his money." "Is all our money gone?" asked Mr. Popper quietly. "Practically all. Of course, when it is all gone, maybe we could eat the 12 penguins for a while." "Oh, no, Mama," said Mr. Popper. "You don't mean that." "Well, I don't suppose I really could enjoy eating them, especially Greta and Isabella," said Mrs. Popper. "It would break the children's hearts, too," said Mr. Popper. He sat there thoughtfully for quite a while. "I have an idea, Mama," he said at last. "Maybe we could sell them to somebody, and then we could have a little money to live on," said Mrs. Popper. "No," said Mr. Popper, "I have a better idea. We will keep the penguins. Mama, you have heard of trained seals acting in theaters." "Of course I have heard of trained seals," answered Mrs. Popper. "I even saw some once. They balanced balls on the ends of their noses." "Very well then," said Mr. Popper. "If there can be trained dogs and trained seals, why can't there be trained penguins?" "Perhaps you are right, Papa." "Of course I am right, and you can help me train the penguins." The next day they had moved the piano down into the basement at one end of the ice rink. Getting a piano downstairs into a basement? Would it fit through the door? Fantasy alert. All right, sorry. Mrs. Popper had not played the piano since she had married Mr. Popper, but with a little practice, she soon began to remember some of the pieces she had forgotten. What does pieces mean in that sentence? Songs. What these penguins like to do most, said Mr. Popper, is to drill like an army, to watch Nelson and Columbus get in a fight with each other, and to climb up steps and toboggan down. And so we will build our act around those tricks. They don't need costumes anyway, said Mrs. Popper. Looking at the droll little figures, they already have a costume. So Mrs. Popper picked out 3 different tunes to play on the basement piano, one for each different kind of act. So the penguins knew from hearing the music just what they were to do. When they were supposed to parade like a lot of soldiers, Mrs. Popper played Schubert's Military March. When Nelson and Columbus were to fight each other with their flippers, Mrs. Popper played the Merry Widow Waltz. When the penguins were supposed to climb and toboggan, Janie and Bill would drag out into the middle of the ice 2 portable stepladders and a board that Mr. Popper had used when he was decorating houses. Then Mrs. Popper would play a pretty descriptive piece called By the Brook, and a brook is a stream. It was cold in the cellar, of course, so that Mrs. Popper had to learn to play the piano with her gloves on. By the end of January, Mr. Popper was sure the penguins were ready to appear in any theater in the country. Checking the time, 6 minutes to go. I can do it. Chapter 14, Mr. Greenbaum. "Look here," said Mr. Popper at breakfast one morning. "It says here in the Morning Chronicle that Mr. Greenbaum, the owner of the Palace Theater, is in town. He's got a string of theaters all over the country." A string string of theaters? What do you think that means? I guess we had better go down and see him. That evening, it was Saturday, the 29th of January. The Popper family and their 12 trained penguins, 2 of them carrying flags in their beaks, left the house to find the Palace Theater. The penguins were now so well trained that Mr. Popper decided that it was not necessary to keep them on leashes. Indeed, they walked to the bus line very nicely in the following line of march. You have this in your book too, I know. That's pretty hilarious. So Mr. Popper, Greta and Captain Cook, Ma and Pa Penguin, Columbus and Victoria, Mrs. Popper, Nelson and Jenny, Magellan and Adelina, Bill Popper, Janie Popper, Scott and Isabella, and Ferdinand and Louisa at the end with the flags. The bus stopped at the corner, and before the astonished driver could protest, they had all climbed on, and the bus was on its way. Do I pay half fare for the birds, or do they go for free? Asked Mrs. Popper. Janie goes half fare, but I'm 10, said Bill. Hush, said Mrs. Popper as she and the children found their seats. The penguins followed in an orderly fashion. Realism or fantasy? What do you think? Say, mister, said the driver, where do you think you're going with that exhibit? Downtown, said Mr. Popper. Here, let's call it 50 cents and let it go at that. To tell the truth, I lost count when they went past me, said the driver. It's a trained penguin act, explained Mr. Popper. Are they really birds? Asked the driver. Oh, yes, said Mr. Popper. I'm just taking them down to the palace to interview Mr. Greenbaum, the big theater owner. Well, if I hear any complaints, off they go at the next corner, said the driver. Fair enough, said Mr. Popper, who wanted to ask for transfers in that case. And that lets you go take another bus ride. If you've already paid for a ticket, that's a transfer. But decided to let well enough alone. The penguins were behaving very well. They were sitting quietly in 2 seats while the other passengers looked on. Sitting quietly, 2 in a seat, sorry. Sorry, said Mr. Popper, addressing everyone in the bus, but I'll have to open all the windows. These are Antarctic penguins, and they're used to having it a lot colder than this. It took Mr. Popper quite a while to open the windows, which were stuck fast. And that doesn't mean they were going fast. Stuck fast means they were totally stuck closed. When he had succeeded, there were plenty of remarks from the other passengers. Many of them began to complain to the driver, who told Mr. Popper to take his birds off the bus. He had to repeat this several times. Finally, he refused to take the bus any farther until Mr. Popper got off. By this time, however, the bus had got so far downtown that none of them minded having to get out into the street. Only a block ahead of them shone the lights of the Palace Theater. Hello, said the theater manager as the Poppers and the penguins trooped past him. Sure, Mr. Greenbaum's here in my office. You know, I've heard about these birds of yours, but I didn't really believe it. Mr. Greenbaum, meet the Popper penguins. I'll be leaving you. I've got to go backstage. The penguins, now standing politely in 2 rows of 6 each. That's like a math array. Math in real life. Looked curiously at Mr. Greenbaum. Their 24 white circled eyes were very solemn. 24, 2 times 12. Oh. All you people crowding around the door, go back where you belong, said Mr. Greenbaum. This is a private conference. Then he got up to shut the door. The Poppers sat down while Mr. Greenbaum walked up and down the double row of penguins, looking them over. It looks like an act, he said. Oh, it's an act, all right, said Mr. Popper. It's Poppers performing penguins. First time on any stage, direct from the South Pole. He and Mrs. Popper had thought up this name for the act. Couldn't we call them Popper's pink-toed penguins? Asked Mr. Greenbaum. Mr. Popper thought for a moment. No, he said, I'm afraid we couldn't. That sounds too much like chorus girls or ballet dancers, and these birds are pretty serious. I don't think they'd like it. All right, said Mr. Greenbaum, show me the act. There's music to it, said Janie. Mama plays the piano. Is that true, madam? Asked Mr. Greenbaum. Yes, sir, answered Mrs. Popper. Well, there's a piano behind you, said Mr. Greenbaum. You may begin, madam. I want to see this act. If it's any good, you people have come to the right place. I've got theaters from coast to coast. But first, let's see your penguins perform. Ready, madam? We'd better move the furniture first, said Bill.